I found a strange newspaper clipping from Moscow that led me down a huge rabbit hole. A professor had stated, "It is not a question of belief. We know that there are such creatures." What creatures? He was talking about beings most people brush off as fake, like miniature people and other bizarre cryptids. But I have an open mind, so I decided to look past the names of these things and see if there were any reasonable truths behind the claims. Get this, the former Soviet Union was indeed doing secret parapsychological research to look for cryptids. But even publicly, this professor, Boris Porshnev, was a Soviet historian and the director of the Modern History Department of the USSR Academy of Sciences. I mean, this is nothing to scoff at. This was a Soviet professor. I mean, just look at the guy. His forehead oozes Mother Russia. These guys are not likely to believe in anything outside of hard science, so this was not just some guy running around the woods hunting for cryptids, like me. A deeper, more mysterious picture started to develop once I knew where to look. I had to wonder, why was the professor so certain that small beings were once real and died out in the 17th century? Why did he claim they were evidence that mankind is devolving, going backwards and not forwards? Were there records he came across in his position that others didn't have access to? With the end of the clipping cut off, I can't see more of what he said that day, and weirdest of all, I can't find the paper where the whole story appeared anywhere. Think about that. But it led me to many more documented sightings of small creatures and historical accounts, and even caught on camera. This world really is a metaphysical place, so let's go through the strangest, most mysterious, and controversial encounters I found with these so-called little people. Then you can decide what it all means. Join me, Rob Counts, for a show that's out of this world. John Hyatt is a university professor and artist in Britain. He took a series of photos in the Rossendale Valley in Lancashire because he was purposely trying to photograph fast-moving things like insects. When he enlarged his images later on the computer to see what he got, he noticed that there were tiny creatures with wings. Check out these photographs. After he exhibited the pictures at a museum, the story of flying humanoids caught on camera went viral around the world. Though he didn't see them with his naked eye, his Nikon D40X certainly had picked them up. Hyatt went out afterwards and took pictures of flies and gnats, but they just didn't look the same. He first stayed on the fence about what they were, but after this strange incident, he started researching all he could about them. He found that Irish, Japanese, and South American cultures all have sightings of these small beings. These creatures were everywhere, but most commonly, they were said to live in the forests. I wanted to make sure I didn't get hung up on the terminology of what names these things were called and just look at the pattern of sightings. That'd give us a bigger picture. One thing he found in history was that some were feared as negative beings with dark, twisted faces. In fact, traditionally, they were seen as harbingers of misfortune. Hyatt said, quote, "I think that's why fairies symbolize death, as they are creatures from the other side. Certainly, in a lot of fairy tales, they are dangerous. I wasn't going through anything when I saw them. The day the photos went viral, I was diagnosed with throat cancer, so it was quite interesting in a sense that for the first month of the fairies going viral, I didn't have any time to worry about having throat cancer because I was talking to people all around the world," unquote. So the day his photographs went viral, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. That's a really strange coincidence. Luckily, Hyatt made a full recovery, and he believed he may have seen the creatures in the first place because he has an open mind. Quote, "Everything gets stereotyped, whatever it is. But there are stranger things in life than fairies, and life grows everywhere. I don't believe they are just smaller versions of us and go home and have a cup of tea at the end of the day, and no one is suggesting they have any special powers. From my experience, they were just enjoying themselves, and there was a little dance in the sunlight going on. They're just beautiful pictures, and beauty can make people believe." Okay, taking a step back and trying not to get hung up on what names he's using and how he's referring to these things, I can see from the photos how they might be real, but what if they were just insects? So I turned to another point of data I have access to that pretty much nobody else does, a professional remote viewer, my co-host on the Metaphysical podcast, John Vivanco. John said he's tasked both experienced remote viewers and classes of new remote viewers as a practice session to remote view this event tons of times. Without knowing what they were being asked to look at, each person separately was asked to use their special remote viewing protocol to describe what they perceived about a series of numbers. They weren't told what the numbers represented, so their imaginations wouldn't get in the way of the raw visual data. But get this, the remote viewing data always came back that this event was real. John Hyatt caught small humanoids on camera. Some people talk about the existence of giants because of large bones that have been found in the Americas, and there are even very large humans around today. But in the not-so-distant past, many people also claimed sightings of something much smaller. But hang on, if there really were little humanoid creatures living on Earth, wouldn't there be some historical record of them? As a matter of fact, ancient accounts of these strange metaphysical beings have been recorded in many cultures. There's a step pyramid in Mexico called the Pyramid of the Magician. It's also known as the Pyramid of the Dwarf. That's because there's a Maya legend that says a dwarf with supernatural powers raised the entire monument in a single night. Yeah, a magical dwarf. But again, let's put down the name for this thing for a minute and see what the information is. The archaeological researcher Graham Hancock found that this isn't the only place associated with the supernatural power of dwarves or little people. Their architectural and masonry skills were widely known, not just here in Mexico, but also across Central America, believe it or not. A Maya legend says that construction work was easy for them because all they had to do was whistle and heavy rocks would move into place. In his book, Fingerprints of the Gods, Hancock wrote that, quote, a very similar tradition claimed that the gigantic stone blocks of the mysterious Andean city of Tiahuanaco had been carried through the air to the sound of a trumpet. That's nuts. In both Central America and in the far-off regions of the Andes, therefore, strange sounds had been associated with the miraculous levitation of massive rocks, unquote. That's pretty amazing, but what's odd is that in Egypt, there is a similar story of a magician raising a huge vault of stone into the air too. So Hancock wondered, could all these very different groups of people in very geographically separate areas have come up with pretty identical fantasies out of nowhere? It seems really unlikely. Ancient building technology could certainly have been preserved in stories like these, a technology capable of lifting huge blocks of stone off the ground with miraculous ease. We know that levitation technology exists today, and that sound frequencies are very powerful. As for a whistling dwarf, if that's just what's describing small people who were using some sort of sonic technology to accomplish what they were building, that's not really that far-fetched. Did you know that an ancient hobbit-sized human species was discovered not too long ago? That made me think, it's not impossible that smaller humans would have once existed just like larger ones, and maybe there's more proof we can find in the past. In 1937, a cave system was discovered in France that had some of the oldest lifelike drawings of human faces that have ever been uncovered. On 155 of the limestone slabs, there were human-like figures. What's strange about that is that these people wearing robes, boots, and hats would date back 15,000 years, long before the time of any of our civilizations as we know them. The BBC hypothesized that human faces might have been painted on the floor in other places. But when people came in to excavate, they would level and strengthen the floor and bury or accidentally destroy these ancient portraits. Now, what if any of those paintings, artifacts, or tools were smaller ones that people today wouldn't expect to find? Wouldn't small civilizations' records have been destroyed more easily? On the floor of one cave was a series of pits arranged in the shape of the Pleiades star cluster. So if tens of thousands of years ago, there were indeed people doing work in caves, making art there, understanding the stars, and even wearing clothes, then they had a certain degree of sophistication, right? The very oldest known mining operations on the planet go back as far as 41,000 BC to a mine in Eswatini, or Swaziland. So there are at least tens of thousands of years in which people have been doing mining operations around the world. Does that require all of them to be today-sized humans? Why couldn't any of them been smaller if these historical accounts exist? I want to bring up one of the weirdest small discoveries that's ever been made in our modern times. Archaeologists opened a sealed tomb from the Ming dynasty in China. They believe they were the first to visit the grave since the person's funeral somewhere between the 13 and mid-1600s. Get this, inside a tomb that was closed for more than 400 years, they found a miniature watch in the shape of a ring marked Swiss. A Swiss watch in ancient China? The size of a ring? How the heck did it get there? The little watch was encrusted in mud and rock, and the time was stopped at 10:06. As far as we know, watches were extremely rare in China back then, let alone Swiss watches, let alone ring-size Swiss watches. Switzerland wasn't even a country yet. I mean, was it possible? Yes, but the chances are extremely low. Movie clocks are usually set to 10:10 because it looks nice on a wall, but this one was 10:06, so it doesn't appear to be some Hollywood fabrication. The curator of the Guangxi Museum said, when we tried to remove the soil wrapped around the coffin, suddenly a piece of rock dropped off and hit the ground with a metallic sound. We picked up the object and found it was a ring. After removing the covering soil and examining it further, we were shocked to see that it was a watch. How in the world did a watch get there in the first place? Why would it have been made in that size at all? Who would have worn such a thing? No part of this story is explainable. But it does make me wonder if it seems more likely that a tiny Swiss watch ring would have been made in the ancient past, or a normal size watch that was made for a smaller person wearing it. What do you guys think? I want to end with the most interesting encounter with a tiny being I've found in our modern times, but I also want to preface this by saying, again, that when people talk about their experiences, they use words like dwarf, elf, fairy, or whatever because that's all they have to use. I mean, that's our vocabulary. I mean, what would you call a tiny human cryptid if you saw one? The actress Carol Burnett wrote in her book how she was suing a newspaper for printing a false story about her. Well, in the morning before she went downtown for the trial, she had a doctor's appointment, and the old Hollywood actress Barbara Stanwyck was in the waiting room, and this is what happened next.
She said, "You know, you're going to whip the inquirer's ass." I said, thank you, Miss Stanwyck, from your lips to God's ears. She said, "No, I know. You know how I know?" No, she said, "My leprechaun told me. The look you have is exactly what I had on my face." I went, "Yeah." She said, "Oh, they exist. My leprechaun said you are going to win this trial and whip the inquirer's ass, and don't you forget it." Well, when she said that, I said, "Oh, no, I won't forget it, Miss Stanwyck." That's my Barbara Stanwyck.
Was the leprechaun right?
Uh-huh. I whipped her ass. Oh, my God.
And Barbara's mysterious intel was right. Carol Burnett won her case. Carol said Barbara had been completely serious about this creature, too. Why would she risk looking crazy to tell Carol something so strange if it weren't true? Barbara didn't publicize this thing all over the press and try to get attention from it. In fact, Barbara had a really successful career doing melodramas, comedy, and movies. So could it be possible she really encountered some smaller being who helped her along the way? And she confided in Carol Burnett when Carol was super stressed out. People are becoming more spiritual and waking up to the reality of multiple dimensions existing, right now, with living beings living in all of them. So for Barbara Stanwyck to have known of the existence of one kind of being, I guess it's not all that weird, especially because her creature knew the truth about Carol Burnett's trial. How would that even be possible? Some of you might be asking, well, Rob, what the heck do you think? Well, I agree with that Soviet professor, the one who told the newspaper that creatures like leprechauns are real, because he said that humanity is going backwards rather than forwards in a lot of ways. Maybe if we find evidence of amazing creatures, or at least have our minds open to the possibilities, we'll get back on track. One thing that's mentioned in historical accounts is how there seem to be several types of these little beings, some of which are positive and some negative. I personally think that the names for some of these things have been mixed up over time, so sometimes their characteristics ended up getting mixed up too. But with such a long history of humanity, I think larger humans and smaller humans probably both existed over time. Our archaeological record and historical accounts are basically proof of that. From whistling dwarves to flying humanoids to archaeological history, there is a lot more to dig into, and I'm just getting started here on Metaphysical. But what do you think? Have you ever seen a little humanoid creature or had other paranormal encounters? Let me know in the comments because I really love reading your stories. They're pretty awesome. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any updates or content drops. If you want to support my work and get access to exclusive episodes and director cuts, you can subscribe to the metaphysical.tv where I have more than 1,000 videos on mysteries, ancient civilizations, and more. You'll never get bored, I promise. Here's a big shout out to our current subscribers because we couldn't keep making this content without you guys. And if you'd like to get yourself a bag of metaphysical coffee, visit the links in the description as well. Thanks so much for watching, and with that, I hope you thought this episode was out of this world.